The sun rose slow and golden over the Llano Estacado, spilling light across rows of young corn swaying in the morning breeze. Jonah Walker stood at the edge of his field, boot soles dusted with soil, hands rough from decades of plow and seed. At 35, he was lean, steady-eyed, and quiet as the land he worked. A man who asked little of the world beyond rain in season and peace beneath his roof. His farm stretched across 100 honest acres in West Texas, passed down from his father, who'd carved it out with sweat and grit after the war. Jonah had grown it with the help of his wife, Mary, whose laugh once filled the house like music, and their 9-year-old son, Eli, whose endless questions made even chores feel like adventures. Neighbors spoke his name with respect, if not warmth. Walker minds his own, they'd say, and his horses are the best broke in the county. They knew he traded fair, never drank past sundown, and always left a jug and sought out when Comanche riders passed. A quiet pact honored since his father's time. Some called it foolish. Jonah called it neighborly. But the winds had shifted. Ranchers to the south whispered of raids, and a trader in town claimed a family near the Pecos was found scalped. Still, Jonah sowed his rows and sharpened his scythe, pretending the world beyond his fences hadn't changed. Yet he noticed the signs. Fewer army patrols, a government surveyor who packed up early, and yesterday, just before dusk, a lone rider had watched from the northern ridge. Too still to be friendly, too far to be sure. Jonah said nothing to Mary. But that night, he slept with his rifle leaned near the bed. Jonah was only gone half a day, just enough time to haul feed from town, and pick up medicine for Eli's cough. But as he crested the last rise before home, a black column rose against the sky like a curse. Smoke, thick and unnatural. He dropped the reins and ran, feed sack forgotten, heart hammering louder than his boots on dry earth. The house was gone, timbers collapsed, fire still eating the edges. The barn doors hung wide, one ripped from its hinges. Chickens scattered, horses gone. He found Mary inside, curled near the hayloft ladder, blood on her dress and a pitchfork in her hand. Her eyes no longer saw. In the far corner lay Eli, half buried in soot and ash, burned, still breathing. Jonah carried his boy outside and screamed into the inferno, a sound not of grief, but something deeper, raw, soul-rending fury. Neighbors arrived too late. No one saw the raiders. No one would ride after them. Sheriff Harding came that evening, hat in hand. Too dangerous out there now. Sorry, Walker. We're spread thin. Might have been Comanche, might not. Jonah didn't respond. Through the night, he sat beside Eli, wrapped in wet cloths and moaning in fever. Just before dawn, he dug a grave beneath the cottonwood, the same tree where Mary once strung up lanterns for Eli's birthday. By sunrise, he stood over the mound alone. No prayers, no tears, just callous fingers tightening into fists, the last of the farmer buried with his wife. Jonah didn't weep. Not when the barn creaked down to embers. Not when Eli moaned in restless fever. Not even when he scattered the last handful of Mary's earth over her grave. Instead, he walked into his cornfield at dusk, struck a match, and let the flames consume every row. What good was harvest to a man with no home? At first light, he rode into town, unshaven, hollow-eyed. By noon, he stepped out of the barber's chair clean-cut. The shadow of the old Jonah burned away. He traded his father's plow for a Henry rifle, sawed off a shotgun, and looped Mary's locket tight around his neck. At the forge, he gave the blacksmith a quiet order. Hours later, a new brand hissed red-hot from the coals. J.W. rimmed in flame. Not for cattle. For memory. The townsfolk murmured as he passed. "He's changed," someone whispered. Something in his eyes. He entered the saloon like a storm. Threw silver on the bar. Names. Who hired the raiders? A drunk sneered. "Maybe your wife should have cooked better." Jonah fired through the table, shattering cards midair. The man slumped before he finished his grin. That was the night the whispers began. The Firewalker had risen. The Llano Estacado stretched wide and wild, but Jonah Walker knew how to move through it like a ghost. He followed broken hoof prints through arroyos, picked cartridge casings from campfire ash, and listened for names whispered in outlaw tongues. One by one, he hunted them. The first fell outside a canyon brothel, drunk, laughing about the widow with the pitchfork. Jonah didn't speak, just stepped from the shadows, pulled the trigger, and left behind a plank marked with the scorched JW brand nailed to the saloon wall. The second tried to run, galloping across a dry mesa. Jonah dropped him at 200 yards with a Henry, left his pistol behind, would branded with that same burning mark, an omen. By the third, they started to talk. These weren't Comanche at all, just hired guns dressed in bone beads and war paint. The real enemy sat in polished boots behind ledgers, land speculators who wanted homesteaders off their claims. Word spread. Townsfolk who once crossed the street to avoid Jonah now nodded slow or left water on their porches. A grizzled deputy named Lorne caught up with him outside a trading post. "What you're doing," he said, eyes sharp, "ain't law, but it might be justice." He handed Jonah a list of names and rode away. In a dry riverbed near Palo Duro, Jonah cornered two more. He shot one through the lung and held the other by the collar as he branded a tree beside him. "Tell your boss," Jonah said, voice low, "the Firewalker's coming." Then he let him go, because fear would carry farther than any bullet. The desert night was cold and wide. Stars spilled like ash across the sky. Jonah and Eli lay beneath a wool blanket near the coals of a dying fire, the boy's breath soft and shallow against his chest. "Pa!" Eli whispered. "Why don't we go back to planting?" Jonah stared at the stars for a long time. "Because they'll keep burning what we plant unless someone stops them." Silence. Then the sound of a coyote howling far off, mournful and lonely. Later, when Eli slept, Jonah sat alone by the fire, staring into its flicker. He remembered Mary in the corn rows, sunlight in her hair, laughing as Eli stumbled through his first book. Her voice still echoed, cruel in its sweetness. That night, he let himself weep, quiet, bitter sobs that no one but the wind heard. By morning, the tears were gone. The steel had returned. Outside the next pass, a shadow emerged from the rocks. Takota, a Comanche scout. Word of the Firewalker had reached even the tribes. "You carry fire," Takota said, studying Jonah's face. "Good or bad depends on your aim." Jonah nodded, silent. Together, they rode across enemy land, the wind at their backs and smoke on the horizon. The Devil's Spine rose like jagged teeth from the prairie, a fortress of rock and shadows. Tucked within its crags sat the outlaw stronghold, barrels of ammunition, crates of whiskey, stolen saddles, and the men who had tried to erase Jonah's life. Jonah watched from a distant ridge, calculating. At dusk, he lit a dry thicket half a mile to the south, wind carrying thick smoke toward the hideout. The gang stirred, thinking the fire accidental, or worse, a trap. That hesitation was all Jonah needed. He moved like vengeance itself, silent until the first shot rang out. Then thunder exploded through the spine. 5 men, 1 Firewalker. He dropped 2 with his Henry before they even saw him. Another charge with a shotgun. Jonah took a round in the shoulder, but didn't fall. Blood soaked his shirt, but his aim held true. The 4th man tried to surrender. Jonah didn't shoot. He just stared, and the man fled. The last stood at the edge of the rocks, Royce Dalton, clean-shaven and snake-eyed. It was never personal, Walker, Dalton said, drawing his pistol. Just business. Your land, wrong place, wrong time. Jonah raised his gun. For me, it always was. He fired once. Dalton collapsed, his ledger of land deeds falling from his coat. Jonah poured kerosene and lit it. Pages curled, blackened, burned. By dawn, a scorched wooden plank hung on a weathered post near the trail. J.W. Justice delivered. Jonah returned to town at sunrise, blood crusted on his sleeve. Eli sleeping against his chest. People stared but said nothing. Sheriff Harding met him at the edge of Main Street, jaw tight. "Far as I'm concerned," he muttered, "I never saw you." Then he tipped his hat and walked away. Jonah used what he took from the outlaws to buy back his land, but he didn't sow another seed. The field stayed fallow. Instead, he built a 1-room schoolhouse on the hill, where children could learn something besides loss. Eli healed, slow but strong. He took to reading like it was salvation. One autumn afternoon, chalk in hand, Eli stood at the slate board and wrote a single word, Firewalker. The class turned to look at Jonah, sitting in the back with his hat low. He didn't smile, just gave a slow nod and looked out the window toward the empty fields. In a smoky cantina in El Paso, a traveling troubadour strummed a battered guitar, voice low and slow with dust and memory. He was just a man with calloused hands, who stood alone against burning lands. With fire and lead he carved his name, and left the plains a whispered flame. The crowd leaned in. Some nodded, others scoffed. He killed 20 men. One grizzled cowpoke muttered. 20? Another snorted. He built a school, planted books instead of bullets. The troubadour just smiled and kept singing. Miles away, under a cottonwood's golden leaves, an old man sipped coffee outside a quiet schoolhouse. His hair was gray, his back stiff, but his eyes still watched the horizon. Eli taught inside now. The children laughed. Jonah said nothing as wind stirred dust across the porch. The legend of the Firewalker lived on. The man himself faded like smoke at dawn. A modern historian's voice cuts in over grainy photographs and faded documents shown on screen. Jonah Walker's homestead records end in 1875. No further land claims. No court filings. But the school he built, that still stands. Became a county building in 1902. The camera lingers on a museum case. Inside, a cracked school slate etched with the word Firewalker, Eli Walker School diploma framed in oak, Mary's burned wedding ring resting beside a scorched piece of would mark J.W. Some say he was a killer, the historian continues. Others, a folk hero. Truth probably lived somewhere between the bullets and the books. But what we know is this: Jonah Walker sowed corn and reaped legend. As the screen fades to dusk over the open plains, cicadas hum and wind whispers through the grass, soft as memory, enduring as myth. And far off, a campfire flickers, just enough to keep the darkness honest.